It's the most consequential shakeup of Israel's court system since the country's foundation. Lawmakers have approved a key part of a controversial overhaul of the judiciary, a bill preventing judges from striking down government decisions if they consider them unreasonable. After the vote was boycotted by the entire opposition, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called his decision to press ahead a necessary democratic step that would benefit the majority of Israel's citizens. But many of those citizens view it differently. The passing of the bill defies 6 months of protests and nationwide outrage against what critics regard as a power grab by Netanyahu's hard-right coalition. And today, again, thousands took to the streets to make their anger and fears heard. Opponents of the law have already announced they'll appeal against it at the very Supreme Court the government is seeking to weaken.
I am 100% in favor of this judicial reform. I think my country needs it.
We feel that it's not a good legislation. We feel that there are not good intentions behind it.
There's no reason to be wary of this amendment. And there are many reasons to see it as an important step in restoring balance between the powers of state and in respecting the voters' will.
There is no prime minister in Israel. Netanyahu has become a puppet on the strings of messianic extremists.
The Israeli parliament has approved a law limiting the Supreme Court's ability to overrule government decisions. Until today, the reasonableness clause allowed judges to block policies or appointments it deemed not in the public interest. Under the new law, the government will be able to hire and fire public servants without judicial oversight. The bill's approval comes despite months of protests that have divided the nation.
One of the most turbulent moments in Israel's 75-year history, soundtracked by chants of busha, the Hebrew word for shame, from opposition parties. The legislation that divided a nation ultimately passed with 64 votes in favour and 0 against, with opposition parties walking out of the Knesset and boycotting the vote. Last-ditch efforts to secure a compromise by the country's president ended without success. The coalition government says the changes are necessary to prevent overreach by the courts and ensure a more equal power balance.
It's definitely an unusual moment. We've taken the first step in a historic process to correct the judicial system and restore powers which were taken from the government and the Knesset over many years.
Coalition parties inside the Knesset celebrated with group hugs and selfies, as police used water cannons and deployed officers on horseback to disperse demonstrators. It was described as a day of destruction at the temple by opposition leader Yair Lapid.
This extreme government is hugging and posing to celebrate the moment they made it so that we are no longer brotherly people. Celebrating the moment they managed to throw into the dustbin of history everything that connects us. There is no prime minister in Israel. Netanyahu has become a puppet on a string of messianic extremists.
Since the draft legislation was introduced in January, it has divided Israel and triggered one of the largest protest movements in the country's history. For 29 consecutive weeks, tens of thousands of Israelis took to the streets of Tel Aviv and other cities. Many came to demonstrate against the planned changes by Netanyahu and his coalition. They argue the overhaul will undermine democracy and remove checks and balances.
We're here to protect our democracy. We were left with no choice but to go to disobedience, non-violent disobedience. We're here to protect our democracy with our bodies.
With protests showing no signs of letting up, opponents of the new law are considering their next moves.
A lot to unwrap, and let's do that with Duff Lieber. He's a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in Jerusalem. Duff, good to have you on the show. Now, this law cancels the reasonableness clause. What does that mean for Israel's system of checks and balances?
Okay, so what this is about really is about the ability of the court to basically have supervision, a type of supervision over government decisions that the government administers, just to make sure that when they make decisions or policy that they're considering all of the relevant factors. Okay, and they can use this ability to judge whether something is unreasonable in the extreme to negate a decision by the government or ministers. So, for example, a recent example was they tried to appoint someone to be the interior minister, the health minister, and a finance minister, someone who was convicted on corruption charges and even recently on tax evasion. So the Supreme Court, some of the justices saw that as unreasonable in the extreme, and this person was unable to take those positions. And the government of Israel very much wants this person to take those positions. This is a key ally of Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister. So this is just an example of how this is used by the court.
Yeah. So what could be the immediate legal and legislative repercussions of this? I'm assuming the government will try to bring these people that were previously blocked on board. Am I correct in that assumption?
Well, we can potentially, this person we're speaking of, his name is Aryeh Deri. He's a key ultra-Orthodox leader of the country. He's been many Israeli governments before. He's most likely will come back if this law passes all the legal hurdles that it still has potentially with the Supreme Court as well. Outside of that, it's not exactly clear what they're paving the way for. I can't really predict. You know, some would like to speculate. Maybe they'll try to replace the Attorney General who oversees Benjamin Netanyahu's trial, which could maybe get him a better plea bargain. But this is speculation, and we don't really know how they will operate once this reasonableness standard is removed from the judge's arsenal, really.
Beyond what you just mentioned, could this have any repercussions on the Prime Minister's corruption trial?
As I said, it could, in terms of, you know, removing certain justice officials who are in charge of overseeing that trial. Again, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, he denies that they will do anything like this, but I cannot say how this will play out, really.
All right. You did recently interview the Prime Minister. What did he tell you about his plans to overhaul the judiciary?
Well, a number of things. Look, the Prime Minister's narrative here is that when they first tried to pass this judicial overhaul, it was basically a package of all of these contentious laws in one shot, and that was in late March. But there was a real national uprising against it, a national strike, and the Prime Minister backed away and opened up a dialogue with the opposition to try to find compromise. Now, the Prime Minister's narrative is that those talks with the opposition failed because the opposition isn't really interested in a compromise, and that he will actually do the compromise himself. He will water down or moderate this legislation himself, although this bill that was passed today was not moderated. But he says that he's working himself to make this a more palatable set of legislation for the other side of the spectrum, the political spectrum. That includes, for example, one of the most contentious laws of the original package was the ability of the coalition to override decisions of the Supreme Court. Netanyahu said in the interview with us that he had thrown that out. Now, his coalition partners say that's not true and that it might come back just kind of a different version. But he's saying that he will try to moderate this legislation himself.
The people who are out on the streets today, as we speak, and have been taking to the streets for the past months, obviously don't believe him. So how big a challenge can the civil uprising, this unprecedented mobilization, become for Netanyahu and his coalition?
Well, in this way, protests are tricky because, you know, they can show a will or opposition of many people in the country, but they cannot force a government or a coalition to do anything that has a majority. There are a few things that can force that, but there are some things in the works that could force the government's hand. For example, another national strike by the labor union, which could paralyze the economy. This is one way that could really put some serious pressure on the government. Or what we're seeing now is protests by reservists in the military who say they will no longer show up for duty. And if that continues, if that trend continues, and if we see it actually play out in manifest in reality in the military, that could be a serious challenge to the government, because senior security officials are saying that even the military chief of staff is saying that this is causing a real problem, or can cause a real problem for the military. So there's just certain levers of or bits of leverage that the protest movement could have on the government.
And our correspondent Tanya Crema joins us from the protests in Jerusalem. Tanya, you're at the protest right now. What have people been telling you?
Well, as you can see and probably hear behind me, we're here right in front of the Supreme Court in Jerusalem. There's no let-up in protest. People have been on the streets here since the early morning, and of course came out again in numbers now after this bill, this law passed this afternoon. And people I have been talking to, we have been seeing here in the course of the evening, the water cannons, just one is moving here again, being driven into the protesters. So what people told me here is that, you know, they're sad. Some of them are shocked. Some of them are really angry about what happened here. It's not just any law. It's one of the basic laws. Israel has no constitution. And this moment is quite unprecedented here for many, many people. And they say, no, there's no let-up. And they don't trust also in what the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said earlier tonight in a speech, where he said, you know, there can be a dialogue, there can be talks about the rest of the overhaul, the reform, as he said. But people are saying, you know, this is just empty talk. We have no trust in any of those talks.
Mm-hmm. This was a first step in what is being called a salami tactic. And Prime Minister Netanyahu says this is a necessary democratic step. What exactly is this law, this bill, going to do?
Well, this particular law is basically now preventing the Supreme Court to have judicial oversight over government decisions it deems unreasonable or implausible. So there has been, for example, talk that the far-right government could now fire the Attorney General. Or in the past, we've seen such a law applied by the Supreme Court when, for example, a politician who had been, convicted of corruption and fraud, he was supposed to become minister, and the Supreme Court cancelled this, saying this is not in the public interest that such a person would become minister. So these are the consequences of this law. Again, this is just a first step in this whole overhaul that is being planned. And now the Knesset will go soon into recess, into a summer pause and the summer holidays. We're expecting, of course, that more laws, what we heard at least from the coalition government, they already have been saying this today, that they will continue to push for this judicial overhaul.
That was Tanya Crema in Jerusalem reporting from the protests there. Thank you so much.